Tēnā koe, I call Paul Foster-Bell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and might I say it's a pleasure to speak on the Christchurch City Council Rates Validation Bill under the speakership of such a distinguished and illustrious member of this House. Sir, I'm taking this call in this debate on the Christchurch City Council Rates Validation Bill because, as previous colleagues have rehearsed the argument several times, I think it is necessary, given some of the comments made by members opposite, just to repeat them one more time. This is something that we do reluctantly, passing retrospective legislation in this House. I think it was in the second reading debate, sir, that I expressed my personal reluctance to consider retrospective legislation unless there was a very good reason to do so. And if I may once again refer to the preeminent legal theoretician, Professor Dicey, the former Vinerian Professor of Law at Oxford, who talked about retrospective legislation. And Professor Dicey, Mr. O'Connor, he was a very highly respected Oxford legal theoretician of the 19th century, a Vinerian Professor of Law. He made the point that retrospective legislation could either be very, very bad or it could be something that is necessary and tolerable. So the examples that he used to use of monstrous retrospective legislation, one of the key examples of evil retrospective legislation that he would always cite was the Habeas Corpus Suspension Act of 1792, which was a very unworthy piece of legislation that was most unjust. Whereas he did also believe that it was possible to have curative retrospective legislation that set something right that was done wrong. And this bill, Mr. Speaker, I genuinely believe falls into the curative category. It does amend a technical deficiency, and as my learned colleague Scott Simpson, the chairman of the committee, has referred to previously in his own contribution on this debate, there are no people who will be required to pay additional rates or levies because of this curative piece of retrospective rates validation. In fact, the technical deficiency was simply in the wording of the ratings motions which were passed by successive Christchurch City Councils over a period of as much as 10 years. So I think it is very important that we do set this wrong right, and this bill does so. And to other critics of retrospective legislation, I'd also refer to recent research which has demonstrated that in the Commonwealth of Australia, a very comparable jurisdiction, I suppose, to our own, up to 20% of legislation does carry some form of retrospectivity in it. So this is not entirely unusual. We have been here before, sir, and when sitting on the Select Committee, one of my main concerns was to ensure that we do not end up here again having to retrospectively validate rates for another council in New Zealand. And whilst we were not able to receive an ironclad, watertight guarantee from officials that such an issue may crop up again in the future, I think, sir, being a competent government on this side of the House, being a very efficient government on this side of the House, as opposed to the members opposite, we can have some confidence that this is one of the last rates validation bills, hopefully, that this House will have to address, particularly dealing with such an issue in the manner that we are today. There have also been comments made, sir, about the competence of the officials who tendered the advice to the Council over the course of a 10-year period where rates were incorrectly set. And I am actually prepared to stand by the comments of my colleagues on this side of the House and the criticisms and concerns that they have. Firstly, because when we had Christchurch City Councils appear before us on the committee, there was a complete lack of contrition. We did not have from highly paid officials any sense of regret or of, in fact, apology to the ratepayers of Christchurch or the taxpayers of New Zealand who are faced with a bill, probably in the many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, to pass this piece of legislation. There was no real apology for the incompetence that led us into this position. So that was, in my view, regrettable. And I do appreciate the arguments advanced by some that the people who we saw on the Select Committee who were advocating, the only only submitters, in fact, advocating on this bill, or the only submitters we heard on this bill, were not those responsible for the initial error. They were officials who are the current incumbents, but they made the point that councillors involved with the initial incorrect setting and the officials, including the chief executive of the time, involved with the incorrect motions were no longer employed at council or no longer served on council, and that's a point that's not entirely lost on me, sir. But we do have a situation where taxpayers and ratepayers have been put to some considerable expense and inconvenience to have to remedy the situation. So I think we do need to send a very strong message to officials and councils up and down New Zealand that it is paramount that they do understand what is required in the law. It's not actually a huge piece of legislation that they have to come to grips with in terms of understanding the framework in which we set local government rating in New Zealand. So it's very important that they do understand it, understand the technical detail and apply it correctly so that we do not end up once again in a situation where we are expending significant amounts of ratepayer and taxpayer money to retrospectively remedy a situation as we have here. Now, sir, there was a question that came up during the second reading debate, and I put the question to the Minister, and we actually had a very clear answer from the Minister, and that was around what is actually covered by this retrospective validation bill. So not only does it cover the incorrectly levied rates, which were levied over a 10-year period from 2003-04 to 12-13 inclusive, but there were a number of subsidiary rates and charges that were also levied incorrectly. These, sir, were the Church Bay sewer loan rate, the Church Bay water loan rate, the restricted water targeted rate, the waste minimisation rate, and the water fire service connection rate for those financial years, the same as for the uniform annual general charge that were incorrectly levied. So I think the Minister did give us a full explanation and description around that. There is something in the order of $600,000 worth of unpaid back rates which should have been paid, which the citizens and the ratepayers in question did not behave correctly in not paying the $600,000 worth of back rates, which do require this retrospective validation to be enacted in order for the council to be legally able to collect those $600,000 worth of back rates. So that is another reason that this validation bill is required, sir. But I do come back to the point that the bill does not prejudice the interests of otherwise law-abiding Christchurch residents who have, over those years, paid their rates thinking that they had been correctly levied, and as we have now discovered, they haven't. Now, just to make things really clear, sir, I do want to reiterate some details of the original failure. That was a breach of Section 24 of the Local Government Rating Act 2002. That is the principal act that determines how local government rating is levied in New Zealand. That talks about how rates are levied, that they are available to be paid in instalments, and setting the payment dates for those instalments. And sir, I think it is a credit to the people of Christchurch and a credit to New Zealanders in general that there are so few uncollected rates as only $600,000 worth in a great city the size of Christchurch, which is the home to so many hundreds of thousands of souls and is arguably the second city of New Zealand after Auckland and arguably, obviously, the capital, Wellington. But I think it is a credit to the taxpayers and the ratepayers in Christchurch that such a small portion hasn't been paid, and there will always be cases, I suppose, where some people don't feel that they are obliged to meet their full obligations and make their contribution to the running of their city and the infrastructure and the services that the council provides for. So the failure to resolve was actually a breach also of Section 57 of the Act, and that was around how penalties are added and calculated to those unpaid rates that were incorrectly levied in the first place. So those two errors are being remedied in this piece of legislation, sir. It is a necessary thing. It's something we do reluctantly. We need to send a strong message to councils that they must get it right to prevent such a waste of parliamentary time in the future. And I'd just make the final point that the retrospective element, although best avoided, is something in this case which is necessary. It is curative, and for all of those reasons, sir, I commend this bill to the House.